Hi there, this is Chapter 1. What I'm going to do throughout this course is that for every chapter, there is a PowerPoint produced by your textbook publisher, and you will have a copy of that PowerPoint. But you will also have a series of videos that I will make where I narrate the PowerPoint. And the way it works is that each of the videos will be 15 minutes or less. And for most chapters, it will take at least 2 of those 15-minute videos, maybe 3. And so when you're studying for a test, you can read your textbook, you can look at the PowerPoint produced by Pearson, and you can watch the videos where I talk about the PowerPoint produced by Pearson. The trick is this, that anything that I say on these narrations, anything that's in the PowerPoint, whether I talk about it or not, and anything that's in your textbook is fair game on your test. You'll have 3 tests. Each test is going to cover 5 chapters, and it'll be a 100-question test, so that's a lot of material to cover. And so it's really important that you read your textbook, that you take notes, that you study from these 3 different sources that I'm giving you. So the first chapter, we're going to be looking at what is special education and inclusion, what are the laws that govern it. We'll talk in some detail about IDEA, which is the major piece of legislation that governs special ed. And then we'll talk about what the responsibilities are for teachers, classroom teachers who work with children with special needs. And we'll also talk about inclusion and what are some of the opportunities for inclusion and what are some of the challenges for inclusion. So when we first start talking about special education, we start in the 1950s. Before I started school, there were very few places that had special ed classes in the public schools. Now, there were some special ed schools, there were some residential facilities, but the public schools just weren't doing anything. So there were some court cases that led to there eventually being services for children with disabilities in all the public schools. The first one was called Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Children versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, 1971. In this case, there were 2 issues that the case was filed on. The first one was free appropriate public education, and this is how this worked. There were some children with disabilities in Pennsylvania that were not in school at all, that had been turned away by the school because they were told that they couldn't learn. There were some children that were in school. It seemed like they had disabilities, but the school wasn't doing anything about it. There was another group of kids that had disabilities. They were identified as having disabilities. They were in a special education classroom, but they weren't being taught anything. They were just being kept warm, dry, and happy, as we jokingly would say. And then there was a last group of kids that were in special education classrooms, but it wasn't really clear that they had a disability. We jokingly would say that they had FLK syndrome, funny-looking kid, that some general ed teacher would say, oh, that's a funny-looking kid, get him away from me. And that was basically all it took for a kid to be sent down the hall. There were kids that were in special ed their entire school career and their parents never knew it. So when this court case was filed, what the plaintiffs were saying was that there wasn't any set of rules or procedures that determined how a child ended up receiving special education services or not receiving special education services. So that was due process. The free appropriate public education said, you can't turn us away from the door because you think we can't learn. So when it got to court, what the big issue became in this case was the educability, the idea that the state was saying there were some children so disabled that they could not learn. And so what the court said was, no, that everybody can learn something. So you cannot turn them away from the door on the basis that they cannot learn, and because you've got them in the school, you've got to educate. So in 1972, there was another case called Mills versus the Board of Education for the District of Columbia. And the Mills case had to do with The same two issues, free appropriate public education, due process. The District of Columbia, after they were taken to court, agreed to provide the services, and then after a few years, they quit doing it. So the parents pulled it back into court, and what the district said was, we don't have any money. So we would love to do this, but we don't have any money. And so what the court said was, you know something? If you are educating anybody, you got to educate everybody. It would be like this. If you had a child in Cleveland District in 3rd grade, and you got a letter today saying, Cleveland District's out of money, so we're not going to have 3rd grade this year. Just keep all the 3rd graders home, and we'll let them come back next year. Parents would go crazy. And so what the court said was, that is just as foolish to say we're not going to serve special ed kids as it would be to say we're not going to serve 3rd graders. And so what they said was that you have to serve everybody. And so the principle that came out of this was what's called zero reject, that if a child is identified as having a disability, he has to receive services, and you can't put him on a waiting list. 1982, there was a case called Board of Education versus Hendrick Hudson Central School versus Raleigh. In this case, Amy Raleigh was a little girl who was deaf, and her parents were saying that she needed a sign language interpreter and the school district should pay for it. Well, the law actually does allow for the school district to pay for a child's sign language interpreter. But what the school said was that Amy was doing all right, that she was making B's and C's, and so they shouldn't have to pay for it because it really wasn't necessary for her to benefit from school. The parents said, oh, but she could be making A's if she had a sign language interpreter. What the court said was that for allowable services, the district does not have to give the best services, and the district does not have to guarantee that the child will excel. They only have to guarantee that the child has access. And so what they said was that if the parents wanted to pay for it, fine, but the district did not have to pay for it. Honig versus Doe, 1988, had to do with behavior. There were some children who had learning disabilities who came to school with weapons, and they were expelled from school. The parents said, oh, you can't do that, because what they did was a result of their disability. And so out of the result of the Honig versus Doe case was that if we're going to suspend or expel a child from school who has a disability, we have to first determine whether what they're doing is a result of their disability. Now, we can still put them in temporary placement if they have dangerous behavior like weapons, drugs, alcohol, but we have to look at their plan, and we have to make sure that there's a behavior plan that's addressing what it is that they're doing if it's part of their disability. If it's not part of their disability, we can just throw them out on their ear just like we would anybody else. Okay. One other case that I want to mention that is not on the list is from 1979, and it is Mattie T, M-A-T-T-I-E, and then the initial T, versus Holiday, and this is from the state of Mississippi. And this case had to do with FAPE and due process, but it especially was looking at protections in assessment. It was filed in 79, and it was finally settled in 2010. Wow. And so some of these court cases take forever to settle. Okay. No Child Left Behind is the major legislation for education, period, in the United States. It was originally called the Elementary and Secondary School Act. It's on one of the previous slides. But the new version of it, that's now called No Child Left Behind from 2001, says that the schools have to be accountable. That's why we do all that testing. There has to be school choice, so that if you're in a failing school, then you have to be allowed to move your child to a school that's not failing. And then greater flexibility for how states and school districts use the money that they get from the federal government. IDEA is the major legislation in the field of special education. It was originally passed in 1975. My first year of teaching in 77 was the first year of full implementation of IDEA. It's been reauthorized several times since then, and the most recent version is 2004. So here are some of the things you need to know about IDEA. The first one is zero reject. And so what this means, I already mentioned it, is the idea that if a child's identified, he has to be served and he has to be given education that is appropriate to his needs, but also gives him maximum access to the general ed curriculum. The states have to actually go out and find kids with disabilities. It applies to ages 3 to 21 in the schools, but there's also a provision for birth, and your book is wrong. It says birth to. It's birth through to, so it's birth up to the third birthday. And in Mississippi, that program is administered by the Department of Health. This is the Birth to program, administered by the Department of Health, but the services are actually provided by the Department of Mental Health. And I know that's weird, but you know how we are in Mississippi. Non-discriminatory evaluation means that a child, if we're testing him for special education, he has to be tested in his native language. He can't be placed on the basis of a single test. He has to be tested in all the areas that are related to what his suspected disability is. He has to be tested by a team of people, and those people all have to be qualified to be giving and interpreting the tests that they're giving and interpreting. An IEP is an individualized education program. It's updated every year, and we'll talk about that one in quite a bit of detail later. Least restrictive environment means that the child should be spending his day where he would spend his day if he did not have a disability. So if he's in third grade and he's living next door to me, then he would be in Park School, because that's where third graders on my street go to school. And so if he has a disability and he's in third grade, he should also be in Park School. And he should be in third grade. Due process means that not only that we have the rules and regulations about how a child becomes eligible for special ed, like I talked about when we were talking about the court cases, but it also means that if the parents and the school have a disagreement, that there are a set of procedures for them to be able to settle their disagreement. Confidentiality of records, that's true in all of education. Advocacy means we have to have procedures to advocate for the needs of the kids with disabilities. The state has to have opportunities for what we're going to do for school districts that are in non-compliance. And then parental participation. Parents have to be not just allowed but encouraged to participate in their child's education. Some other things that we need to know about IDEA: use of person first language. I'm going to do a separate mini video about person first language. Provision for school districts to be sued if they're in violation of IDEA. Once they've gone through due process, then people can sue the school districts. Assistive technology for kids that, for instance, can't walk or talk. Involvement of children with disabilities in the general ed curriculum as much as is possible. That includes kids with severe disabilities being in a regular classroom for all or part of the day. And greater accountability so that kids with disabilities are in the same assessment system as kids in general ed. Some other provisions we have to have: the IEP has to tell in detail what kind of aids and accommodations we're using. The districts have to allow children to keep the generic developmental delay label for kids that were identified in preschool, to let them keep that generic label up until age 9. Have to allow for special ed teachers that are in an inclusive setting to work with anybody that needs help, not just with special ed kids. And then last, special ed has to be based on what the research says. I already talked about discipline. We have a whole chapter on response to intervention. I already talked about early intervention. Already talked about IEPs. We're going to get that in detail later. Monitoring, the state has to monitor special education programs. Highly qualified teachers, special ed teachers have to be highly qualified like anybody else. And private schools the public school has to make sure kids in private schools are offered services if they have disabilities.